Imagine standing at the threshold of the most profound secret in human history. Not a secret buried in the vaults of a shadowy institution, not encrypted in a forgotten cipher, but hidden in plain sight, printed billions of times across billions of pages. In the very book that half the world calls holy. Open any Bible, flip to Exodus chapter 3. Read the moment when Moses, a shepherd wandering the desert, witnesses a bush that burns without being consumed. From within that fire, a voice speaks. Moses, trembling, asks the question that every soul in every age has ultimately dared to ask. What is your name? The answer given is not a title. It is not a description. It is not a role or a rank. It is a name. 4 ancient Hebrew letters. Yod, Heh, Vav, Heh, Yahweh. And then quietly, across centuries of translation, politics, and religious authority, that name disappeared. What if the most powerful word in the Bible, the name of God, was never meant to be a title, but a sacred, personal connection? And what if one ancient civilization refused to let it be erased? The Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, contains the name Yahweh exactly 6,828 times. Not occasionally, not symbolically, 6,828 times. In almost every chapter, in almost every book, embedded into the very DNA of the text. This was not an accident. In ancient Israelite culture, a name was not merely a label for identification. A name was a revelation of character, a declaration of essence, a bond between persons. When God spoke his name to Moses, he was not offering a password or a title. He was entering into covenant, establishing an intimate, personal relationship with a specific people in a specific moment of history. The Tetragrammaton, derived from the Greek for 4 letters, was the holiest utterance in all of Hebrew scripture. The ancient rabbis taught that Yahweh was the name above all names, the ineffable word through which creation itself was spoken into being. When the Israelites heard it, it was not background noise, it was electric. It carried weight, responsibility, and the trembling acknowledgement that the living God was not an abstraction. He was present, personal, and known. Consider what it meant to pray to a God whose name you knew. There is an intimacy in naming. You call out to a parent, not the parental unit. You call a friend by name, not acquaintance. The relationship Israel had with Yahweh was precisely this: charged, direct, covenantal. And when you call upon a name, something shifts. You are no longer speaking into the void, you are speaking to someone. So why, when you open most modern Bibles, do you find not the name Yahweh, but only the word Lord printed in small capital letters like a legal footnote to something that was once a thunderclap? The story of how Yahweh became Lord is not a single dramatic moment. It is a slow current, moving through centuries, carrying sediment from 3 great civilizations, Greek, Roman, and European Christianity. It begins around 250 BCE in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The Jewish community there had largely lost fluency in Hebrew. They spoke Greek, and so, under the reign of Ptolemy II, a group of Jewish scholars, tradition says 72 of them, were commissioned to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This translation became known as the Septuagint, named for the Latin word for 70. And here, for the first time, the translators made a fateful decision. Wherever the Hebrew text read YOWH, the Greek translation substituted the word Kyrios, meaning Lord. The motivation is understandable, even reverent. By the Second Temple period, many Jewish communities had adopted the practice of not pronouncing Yahweh aloud, treating the name with a kind of protective silence. But in translation, that silence became something else. It became substitution. And substitution, once embedded in a sacred text, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. The Septuagint was the Bible of the early Christian church. Paul quoted it. The gospel writers drew from it. And so, from the very beginning of Christian scripture, the name of God was already filtered through this translation layer. Then came the Latin Vulgate, the Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, translated by Jerome in the late 4th century CE. Again, Kyrios became Dominus, Lord, Master. The name of God had now passed through 2 layers of translation, each time traded for a title of authority and hierarchy. By the time the King James Bible was commissioned in 1604 and published in 1611, the English Bible that would shape the spiritual imagination of the English-speaking world for 4 centuries, the pattern was so established, so deeply assumed, that the translators did not question it. They printed Lord in all caps where Yahweh appeared, a typographical convention acknowledging that something had been replaced, while doing nothing to restore what was lost. 6,828 times, and the name each time buried beneath a title. A title tells you someone's position. A name tells you who they are. We were given a position. We lost a person. To understand why a name is suppressed, you must first understand what a name gives you. Power, access, intimacy, and these are things that empires, religious and political, are deeply reluctant to distribute freely. Consider the world in which the early Christian church grew. Rome was the supreme power on earth, and Rome's power was legitimized in part by its religious architecture. Its pantheon of gods, its emperor worship, its hierarchies of priests who mediated between the populace and the divine. To allow every ordinary person direct, named access to the God of the universe was, in a real sense, politically subversive. Institutional religion has always understood, consciously or not, that if God is a distant authority accessible only through proper channels, then the institution becomes the channel. If God has a personal name that any farmer or fisherman can call upon directly, the intermediaries become less essential. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is simply the logic of institutional power applied to the sacred. The progressive replacement of Yahweh with Lord, a title that also applied to kings, emperors, and landowners, subtly repositioned the divine from the personal to the hierarchical. God became, in language at least, more like a monarch than a father, more like an emperor than a covenant partner. There was also, to be fair, a genuine theological reverence behind the avoidance of God's name. The fear of using Yahweh in vain, esbweif, a prohibition found in the Ten Commandments, evolved over centuries into a total prohibition on speaking it at all. What began as holy caution calcified into complete erasure. By the medieval period, even scholars who knew the name rarely spoke it aloud. The pronunciation was so carefully guarded that today, we are not entirely certain how it was originally spoken. Reverence, over time, can become erasure wearing the clothing of piety. Now we turn our lens toward a land that refused the current. Ethiopia, ancient, mountainous, fiercely independent, sits at the Horn of Africa like a sentinel at the edge of time. While empires rose and fell to the north and west, while Rome consumed the Mediterranean and the Church restructured the faith, Ethiopia maintained something that the rest of the world had quietly surrendered. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian churches on earth, tracing its roots to the 4th century CE, and, through its own understanding of history, far deeper into the pre-Christian era. The word Tewahedo itself means being made one, a theological term reflecting Ethiopia's ancient and distinct Christology. This is not a church that borrowed its traditions from Rome or Constantinople. It developed in relative isolation, nurtured by ancient Jewish-influenced practices that predate the divisions of the wider Christian world. The Ethiopian Bible is the most complete biblical canon in existence. It contains 81 books, far more than the 66 in Protestant Bibles or the 73 in Catholic Bibles. Texts that were debated, marginalized, or outright removed from Western canons, books like Enoch, Jubilees, and Maccabean, were preserved in Ethiopian scripture as living parts of the sacred text, and crucially, in the Ge'ez language, the ancient liturgical tongue of Ethiopia, the name of God was not replaced. While Greek translators substituted Kyrios and Latin translators substituted Dominus, Ethiopian scribes preserved the divine name as a transliteration of YHWH, maintaining the personal, covenant character of the relationship between God and his people. Why could Ethiopia do what others could not? Geography played a role. The highlands of Ethiopia were notoriously difficult to conquer, and no Roman emperor or medieval pope ever successfully extended full authority there. But it was not merely isolation, it was conviction. Ethiopia did not merely inherit a set of religious practices, it inherited, and fiercely believed in, a sacred identity. To understand Ethiopia's self-understanding, you must encounter the Kebra Nagast, the glory of kings, a 14th century Ge'ez text that draws on far older oral and written traditions. It is, in Ethiopian tradition, not merely a historical chronicle, but a sacred document of national and spiritual identity. The Kebra Nagast narrates one of Scripture's most tantalizing storylines, the visit of the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda, to the court of King Solomon in Jerusalem. The biblical account in 1 Kings 10 is brief, almost frustratingly so. The Kebra Nagast fills in what the Bible leaves out. According to this tradition, Makeda traveled to Jerusalem, was profoundly transformed by Solomon's wisdom and by the God of Israel, and returned to Ethiopia. The child born of their encounter was named Menelik, son of the wise man. Years later, as a young man, Menelik traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon embraced him and wished him to stay, but Menelik chose to return to his mother's land, and he did not return alone. The Kebra Nagast teaches that Menelik I brought with him from Jerusalem the Ark of the Covenant, the gold-covered chest that housed the Ten Commandments, the physical throne of God's presence among Israel. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark resides to this day in the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion in Axum, guarded by a single monk called the Guardian, whose sole responsibility in life is to protect it. Whether one receives this as literal history or as profound theological self-understanding, the implication is the same. Ethiopia believed it was entrusted with the holiest objects of the Israelite covenant, and if you are the guardian of the Ark, the very dwelling place of the God who spoke his name from fire, would you dare to erase that name from your scriptures? The preservation of God's name in Ethiopia was not a passive accident of geography. It was an act of sacred stewardship. While the world renamed God with the vocabulary of empire, Ethiopia kept the original address, the personal name by which the covenant was made and sealed. There is something that happens when you replace a name with a title. Something shifts in the architecture of a relationship. Consider two different prayers. In the first, a person prays, "O Lord, I come before you today." In the second, YHWH, the one who is and was and is to come, I speak your name today. The first prayer is addressed to a role. The second is addressed to a person. One is formal, the other is intimate. This is not a small distinction. The entire narrative arc of Hebrew Scripture is built on the premise that God initiates personal relationship. He did not appear to Abraham and say, "I am the Lord your God," as a first introduction. He said, "I am YHWH," and made a covenant with Abraham by name. He told Moses his name explicitly because Moses needed to return to Egypt and call the people of Israel together under a specific authority. The name was an anchor for covenant, a signature on a promise. What happens when that anchor is removed? The covenant becomes vaguer. The relationship becomes more abstract. God becomes more like a principle and less like a presence. Faith, when it loses the personal name of its object, drifts naturally toward abstraction, toward systems, toward institutions, toward performance. You can appeal to a principle, but you cannot know one. The Ethiopian tradition preserved not only the name, but also the intimacy that accompanies knowing it. Ethiopian Christian worship is not characterized by the cool distance of abstract theology. It is embodied, sung, danced, wept. The kind of worship that happens when you know, personally, whose name you are calling. Ethiopia's preservation project went far beyond the name of God. The Book of Enoch, attributed to the great-grandfather of Noah, describes Enoch's mysterious journeys through the heavens, his encounters with angels, and visions of cosmic judgment. It was widely read in the Second Temple period, and was clearly known to the writers of the New Testament. Jude, the brother of Jesus, directly quotes from it. Peter's letters reflect its themes, and yet, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, as the Western Church settled its canon, the Book of Enoch was excluded. Deemed too speculative, too visionary, too difficult to control, Ethiopia kept it. The Book of Jubilees, which retells Genesis and Exodus with additional detail and a distinctive theological framework, was treated similarly in the West. Too Jewish, too complex, too insistent on a calendar system that didn't align with Roman liturgical practice, Ethiopia kept it. The Maccabean, a series of books unique to the Ethiopian canon and absent from every other Christian tradition, preserved theological narratives and wisdom literature that the wider church never inherited. Ethiopia kept it. This is the pattern. When the councils of the Western Church, shaped by Roman political theology, by Greek philosophical frameworks, by the pressures of empire and orthodoxy enforcement, drew the boundaries of sacred text, they drew them tightly. Ethiopia, outside those boundaries, did not have to choose what to discard. It had the luxury, born of independence, to keep everything, and in keeping everything, it preserved a picture of God. Personal, named, intimate, covenantal, that the rest of the world had largely filtered out. There's a moment described in the Book of Enoch, a text that Ethiopia never stopped reading, in which the angels are identified by their names, not their titles, their names. Raphael, Gabriel, Michael, Uriel. The text insists on names because in the worldview it inhabits, names are the substance of identity. To know a name is to know a being. To speak a name is to make contact. This logic saturates the Ethiopian spiritual tradition. The long, elaborate liturgical services of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, sometimes lasting through the night, are not performances for an audience. They are addresses to a person. The chanting of the Ge'ez liturgy, the beating of the sistrum drums, the swaying of priests in white robes and golden crowns. These are not ornamental. They are the language of relationship, the language of people who have not forgotten the name of the one they love. In the Ethiopian highlands, where the air is thin and the stars are close, monasteries cling to the sides of mountains. Monks have lived in these places for 1,000 years, copying manuscripts by hand, preserving texts in languages that most of the world had forgotten. These men did not think of themselves as archivists. They thought of themselves as guardians of a living truth. Lalibela, Aksum, Lake Tana, Debre Damo. These are not merely tourist sites. They are depositories of a theological tradition that the rest of Christianity, fragmented by Reformation, rationalized by the Enlightenment, institutionalized by empire, simply no longer has. Ethiopia stands as a living rebuke to the idea that the ancient and the personal were casualties of an inevitable historical progress. They were not inevitable casualties. They were chosen losses, and Ethiopia chose differently. We live in an age of restoration, of reckoning, of a hunger, felt across cultures, faiths, and generations, to recover what was lost. Ancient languages are being revived. Suppressed histories are being told. Texts long hidden in caves and monasteries are being translated and read for the first time in millennia. And in this context, the question of God's name is not merely an academic curiosity. It is a spiritual provocation. Some modern Bible translations, including the New World Translation and the World English Bible, have restored Yahweh or a form of it to the text. Scholars debate the precise pronunciation. Yahweh? Jehovah? But the spirit of the restoration is clear. The relationship was always meant to be personal, and personal relationships require that you know the name of the one with whom you are in covenant. Ethiopia never needed a restoration movement. What the rest of the world is slowly recovering, Ethiopia never released. There is something humbling in this. The nation that the West long considered peripheral, ancient, isolated, poor in the categories that empires use to measure value, turns out to have been the most faithful custodian of the very thing those empires thought they were refining. While Rome built councils to define the canon, Ethiopia was quietly reading books Rome had discarded. While translators were erasing a name, Ethiopian monks were writing it by hand again and again in the lamplight of mountain monasteries. God's name was not lost. It was waiting. Waiting in the scrolls of Echem, waiting in the liturgy of Lalibela, waiting in the deep chant of priests who never stopped addressing the living God by the name he gave at the burning bush. If the name of God is restored to its rightful place, in our scripture, in our prayer, in our mouths, what changes? Will we find that we were never speaking to a Lord from a distance, but to a Father by name? Will the intimacy that Israel knew, that Ethiopia preserved, become available to all who call upon the name that was always there? The burning bush is still burning. The name has not changed. The question is whether we are willing to speak it, and to hear in return the same voice that first spoke it, intimate, present, covenant-keeping, and real.